You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. My name is Orn. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. On today's episode, we are joined by Hassan Abbas to discuss his book, The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali Ibn Abi Talib. I'm super excited to share this podcast with you as a lover of history and a Muslim myself. I think it's really important to study history to understand what's happening in the world today, not only in the Middle East, but also theologically from a religious point of view, and understanding some of the sectarian issues, not only within Islam itself, but also its relationship with other creeds, be it Christianity or Judaism, and also the wider world for those who are either agnostic or atheists. I think this is a podcast mainly for those who don't fall under a religious banner. I think it's really important to try and understand the history of Islam from a point of view of without sectarian divides, because I think it's important to understand what is the history of Islam. And I think this podcast is great for anyone really, whether be Muslim or non-Muslim, to try and understand who was Ali and what was his impact on early Islam and how the repercussions of his death and also the death of the Prophet and his relationship with the Prophet had on Islam in today's world and the effects that that's having in the world. A quick disclaimer for any of our Shia brothers and sisters: during this podcast, both Hassan and I referred to Ali by his name rather than Imam Ali. That is not to be disrespectful in any way, shape or form. That being said, thank you so much for tuning in, and I really hope you enjoy this podcast. I saw this book a couple of months ago. There was an event that you were doing, and I saw it being promoted on Elibet TV, so I thought I'd join it. And as someone who loves history, and obviously being a Muslim and a Shia Muslim, reading about this sort of just drew me straight to it. So I approached you, and very, very thankful for coming on to speak about the book. So what drew you to writing this book specifically?
Looking at the extremism and terrorism related issues, there was this constant feeling, and constantly I heard also, that this is the root cause issue. What is the root cause of extremism? And the more and more I thought of this, I thought whether it is Daesh or Al-Qaeda or Taliban or other extremism, it's first and foremost a sectarian issue within Islam, which then there are concentric circles. And often in the West, it was either ignored inadvertently, maybe unintentionally, that what is the internal dynamic. And when I looked at the internal dynamic, the sectarianism, the bigotry, the divisiveness that is also prevalent, and I thought I wanted to touch on that. I wanted to deal with that issue. And the opportunity came, I thought, rather than writing a dry book on the causes of extremism, I thought, what's the best way? And I was personally greatly inspired by the life and legacy of Ali Ibn Abi Talib. So this was an opportunity for me to tell a story, but also try to answer this question: what is one of the major causes within the internal Muslim narrative, which then leads to divisiveness, extremism, and such issues?
Yeah, I mean, you could have written a book on the geopolitics of the Middle East and its relationship with the West, but I don't think that is applicable to most people. I think the way that you approached it, definitely talking about the history, is very important, because I think it's an issue within the Muslim world, having different views about history and many not even addressing it, which I think is the biggest cause, is many people don't want to address the history. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why you wrote this.
Absolutely. That's true. And also the generalizations that are linked about this issue. Often in the West, and I say as part of the Western tradition now, or culture and society and my identity, and I'm proud of my American identity as well. This issue of generalization and simplification by many people. When I refer to some friends, oh, this is a biography of Ali, they said, oh, the Shia Sunni book, right? I said, yes, but no also. I mean, Ali's life and this biography is about the major principles and themes of Islam as well. And because when most people, non-Muslims, hear about the Shia-Sunni issue, they understand it as a succession battle or political battle. What happened in Islam's early years, and especially the story of Ali ibn Abi Talib, is far more deeper. It is not only about political succession. There's very little about political succession. It is about spiritual succession. It is about the central themes of Islam. It was about how Islam was introduced to the other people. It was about how the idea of sacrifice, the idea of spirituality, the idea of mysticism explained and defined Islam. So it is all these things together, and this was one good hook for me to tell that story to the West.
So for those who are listening that have never heard of Ali or the life of Ali, how would you describe in a short way who he was and why he had such an impact?
A simple question, but an extremely important question. So Ali ibn Abi Talib is the cousin and the chief aide and the closest friend of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace be upon him. Ali was with him from day one when the Prophet started the campaign of the movement of Islam, and Ali was among the first one as a child to raise his hand when the Prophet said, "Is there anyone who will support me and stand by me?" And this is actually narrated in some of the initial historical books. Ali was the first one to raise the hand, and when the Prophet said, "Okay, you are the first one. You are a child. You'll be my successor. You'll be my friend. You'll be my aide." And people around the Prophet laughed and they said, "He's just a kid." But Ali proved it. Ali was trained by the Prophet in the spiritual world as well. After the Prophet became the fourth Caliph of Islam, about 25 years after the Prophet's death. So he was a political successor also among the four top successors. The Muslims call them Rashidun. And then Ali is also the spiritual successor. That is one status. Ali is unmatched in that sense. And no one else among the close associates of the Prophet ever either claimed that they are the supreme spirituals, they have the supreme spiritual status after the Prophet. It was only Ali. And one issue was that Ali claimed himself, Ali believed that he should have been the first political successor as well in that position. And that's where the political succession debate is also relevant. But Ali was, whether it was in the field as a warrior, during the life of the Prophet, whenever there were these, most of those were defensive wars, almost all of those, and Ali was at the front always. Whenever there was a call for someone to stand up and be counted, Ali was in many cases single-handedly there. And then the Prophet's progeny went through Ali. Ali married the Prophet's most beloved daughter, Fatima. Fatima, who was the highest status as a woman in Islam's early years, after and along with her mother Khadija. So, and being father of Hassan and Hussein, two of the most important personalities, the grandsons of the Prophet, Ali having trained them, and the whole legacy of Islam linked to Karbala. So these are the 3 or 4 ways in which Ali is at the center of Islam. And also, last but not the least, today, if anyone wants to look at the history of Islam through sermons, statements, historical record, lucky for Ali that it is his statements, sermons, which the history has recorded in comparison to anyone else. Many of the top Islamic scholars, irrespective of which sectarian group they may belong to, they are on record saying what we have figured out and what we have found about Ali in terms of statements from the Prophet about his elevated status, about his teachings, no one can be compared. There's so much available in the early historical records in praise of Ali, building, explaining the high status of Ali.
I think the point you just touched upon there is really important, because you said that it was both likened from both sides of the debate, which side you fall on when you look at Islam, whether you're on the Sunni or the Shia side. They all are sort of unanimous in their appreciation and the status of Ali and his leadership and obviously spirituality. So in the first part of the book, you talked about the contradictory narratives in historical narratives. So can you just talk about why this has been the case, and also explain some of these contradictions on both sides, to why some people hold him in such a high regard, and others appreciate that regard but then don't sort of acknowledge it.
It's an extremely important aspect of Ali's life, and for those who don't know about Ali, and even those who know at times are unaware of this aspect, what I'm about to mention. The tragedy of all this was that on one side, Ali is one about whom the statements of the Prophet are as obvious as, for example, there's one in Arabic which is called Man kuntu Mawla fahaza aliyan Mawla. The Prophet, just before his death, a couple of months before his passing away, took Ali in front of a huge gathering on his return from Hajj, and raised Ali's hand and said to everyone, "Whosoever among you consider me to be your master, Mawla, should see Ali as the master as well." There was another occasion where the Prophet said, "Ali is to me what Aaron was to Moses." That was an extremely insightful comparison, because the Islamic book, the Quran, the divine book, refers to the status and the closeness and the succession that Aaron had in reference to Moses. There are multiple other references in Quran, but just one I would mention. There's at one point it was mentioned that, "O Prophet," God addressing the Prophet, saying, "Tell the people that you deserve or you ask for nothing in response to the role that you have played for the mission of Islam, except that your closest ones are loved." And people asked the Prophet, "Who are the closest ones?" And this is based again on Sunni and Shia narratives as a consensus. The Prophet said it's Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein, the closest family members. Having that kind of status, which is again unmatched, no one else. There are many other important close personalities, but there's nothing in the historical references or books which gives evidence of such level or such status of such statements as the Prophet had said about Ali. And despite that, or there is a history where right after the uh, assassination of Ali, or martyrdom of Ali, when he was a caliph for 4 years and he was uh, killed in a mosque, right after that, the other political player of the time, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who's the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, which is the dynasty that comes just after the four political representatives of the Prophet. Ali was cursed through the Friday sermons for 40 years at a stretch. And this is not a hidden secret. My book is not the first one which is telling this. History books are full of this fact. So there's that first massive contradiction that most Muslims, may I respectfully say, in the Sunni tradition, most Sunni Muslims ignore that. Ignore that not because they don't like Ali. Ignore that because history was written in a fashion, or history was written, as we know, history is always written by the victor. So the Umayyad dynasty, which was the first powerful dynasty, they that dynasty was a challenge to some of the ideas of the Prophet. Although it came across as a Muslim group which is reflecting the message, which is expanding the frontiers of Islam, but at the same time, it produced Muawiyah's son Yazid, who is the one who butchered and the family of the Prophet Hussein. And this again, all Muslims, irrespective of their sectarian or religious identity or inclination. Even when it comes to Karbala or Hussein, there is no division between the conservatives and the liberals, or the Muslims who are very, very secular, or those who are very, very conservative and practicing. Everyone mourns the death of Hussein. Who killed Hussein? Muawiyah's son Yazid killed Hussein and the family. So the tradition of Banu Umayyah, or Umayyads as we say, it had some good leaders as well in that reign. But that is the time where the history was distorted, and they had this. And the question is why there were some Muslims in Umayyads who hated Ali. Um, and that the fact is that Ali had stood by the Prophet at a time when no one else was. Ali, through his bravery, courage, determination, and many of the Umayyads and their forefathers or their family elders were the ones who had received justice at the hands of Ali for the cause of Islam. But the tribalism was so entrenched that when Umayyads got their chance, they had become Muslims, but they had not given up their baggage of their tribalism. And they had looked at Ali as, oh, Ali is the one who had killed my father, my uncle, or in the battlefield, or whatever. They would forget what their parents or their family members or their tribe was doing. So it's basically Umayyad dynasty was also a reflection of those tribal entrenched realities. So Ali's message was that of egalitarianism. And if I add one more point, when Ali became the caliph, and if we have a chance, I'll talk more about it. He stood for accountability. He stood for egalitarianism, and these are not mere words that we are picking up from the modern Western tradition. These are very sound ideas which have words that express in the Arabic language. And Ali, the very first day when Ali became caliph, he said, "For me, everyone among you is equal." He didn't say Muslim, non-Muslim, those who like me, those who are against me. He said, "I am going to build my government on based on justice against some of those elitist Muslims who had acquired wealth and had become part and parcel of the governance system." Ali said, "If you will not fulfill these roles based on your merit, justice, you are out." And Ali kicked them out from top positions. All of those people who were at the receiving end of Ali's justice and accountability also later on started abusing Ali, cursing Ali, killing his family. So that is the biggest contradiction. Those who like Ali continuously, whether in songs or poetry or his status, and then just look the other way when it is time to expose those who actually tried to damage the legacy of Ali. That was not only the biggest challenge to Ali, that is the biggest challenge to Islam. And I argue in the book, there was a counter revolution. So many Muslims want to totally ignore because they want to see the Muslim history as all good. And they forget that Islam is not necessarily equal to Muslims. By exposing those who played a terrible role in Islamic history, you are not trying to defile, or you are not trying to demean Islam. Islam stands as a religion. The Muslims, many Muslims in the early part of Islam were jealous, were tribal, were politically oriented. They were at one point very close to the Prophet. To be close to the Prophet didn't mean that they had given up their jealousies, their politics. After the Prophet, they became very brutal at times. They remained Muslim in terms of their identity, but in their actions, they damaged the cause of Islam. To expose them, to talk about them is not sectarianism. It is about some realities. So Ali's enemies are also very clearly in front of us through the history book. Most Muslims ignore it, avoid it, thinking, oh, this will give a bad name to Islam. But in the process, they are covering up issues which they need to be very clear about, because then if you start covering up, it becomes a part of your mindset. It becomes a part of your narrative, and you start ignoring some of the negative issues among the Muslims today. It has an impact on your thinking and on your pattern. These are the kind of contradictions that I think must be talked about.
Yeah, one of the big ones in entrenched thinking is the one of the companions, because it's almost as if the individuals today hold the companions in such high regard that they can't be questioned, or their actions can't be questioned. You question a companion, even if he just saw the Prophet at the time, and how do you define a companion is another one. It's like, what is a companion? How do you go about defining that? And it's almost like they put a barrier in front of a companion and say, you can't question that. They did XXX because they're a companion and you can't question them. So I think that's one of the major things in Islamic history as well.
So well said, absolutely. And this is also, again, a way to further push a very disputed narrative, which was part of the official Islam. I mean, during the Umayyads and then Abbasids, there was a reaction to Umayyads, and in the name of the Prophet's family, another dynasty was created. They were initially very respectful to the family of the Prophet, and the family of the Prophet is not only important because it's the family of the Prophet. There were many members of the family of the Prophet which are not mentioned in the history book. For example, Ali's brother, Ali's father is known as And even Ali, we call Ali Ibn Abi Talib. So Abu Talib, the father of Ali, who had groomed the Prophet, who had actually played one of the most important roles in the life of the Prophet. His first son, for him, he was named as Abu Talib. Talib, the real brother of Ali, is not. You will not find anything about him in the history book, because he's, some believe, remained on the other side of the divide, with the those who challenged the Prophet. So he's not mentioned, even though he's son of Abu Talib, very close to the Prophet, brother of Ali. So the criterion is not that only some are respecting Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet, just because they are family of the Prophet. They had the credentials. They paid through sacrifices. They stood by the Prophet. They sacrificed everything they had to keep that spiritual message alive. So that's the reason. When you compare them with companions, so ordinary Muslim would say, we respect the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. We also respect everyone else who's companion. You just cannot compare, not to demean the companions, but there were so many companions who were also sitting with Yazid. Yazid, who had killed the family of the Prophet, many of them. Uh, so, will you just ignore them, those killers? There were others who had challenged, for example, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, a very close friend of the Prophet, a respected person. And there were so many Muslims who challenged his status, and they said, we will not pay the taxes, the zakat, and others. They were also companions, those who were fighting. They were not non-Muslims. So will we say those who challenged Abu Bakr? There was other people who fought the second Caliph Umar, challenged him. There were people killed by him. There were people who were hanged for crimes. They were also companions. So you cannot give us standard statement that every companion, all those who are saying all companions are sacred, in fact, are trying to cover up history. It's because without knowing, they just don't want these contradictions to come out. And I must emphasize, the purpose of exposing some of these contradictions is to try to figure out where the Islamic narrative went in a direction which it becomes so confusing for many Muslims. I mean, for the Shias and Sunnis or many other groups, Ismailis, even Salafis, Sufis, for them, those who grow up in this tradition, it's easy because you are normally introduced to only your books from your sect, and you never even at times, you are not aware of those contradictions. The new Muslims or the converts or the other people who are normally extremely secular, and they want to learn more about history, then they start looking, because they don't know, I'm supposed to go beyond the Shia books, I'm supposed to go beyond the Sunni books. They look at everything and they say, what is this? These are entirely different historical records. What really happened early on? That's why it is important to be fair and be honest and say they're companions who were terrific people who loved the Prophet. That's why Islam expanded. Islam was not only Ahlul Bayt. They were companions who did amazing things. I have profiled many of the companions. In fact, I built my story around some of the most important companions, many of them who are not recognized by most Muslims, because some of them were very brave to explain and actually expose these contradictions. For example, if your audience want to know about any companions, I would say there's one, Abu Zar Ghaffari. Many people say he was the founder of in a sense, the Marxist ideas, because he was a very egalitarian person. He would fight for the rights of the people. He would go to the caliphs, the early caliphs, first and second and third, most specifically, Usman, all very important people, all whose their contributions we cannot negate or just ignore. But Abu Zar Ghaffari would go and challenge them when he would see a wrong appointment, when he would see some nepotism. And Abu Zar Ghaffari was such a close companion of the Prophet that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had said, I know of no one other among my companions who's as truthful as Ghaffari is. Big statement. And then Ghaffari, when he challenges the third caliph, Usman, telling him that he was appointing too many of his family members and friends, and even those who were very corrupt. He was kicked out. He was said, "You cannot stay here." He went to Syria. In Syria, Muawiyah was the governor, who said, "Get out of here," because no one wanted to be challenged. And then Abdul Ghaffari died out of the main city in isolation. And that's a tragic story. Islamic history is full of praises, whether Shia history or Sunni history or Sufi history. They're full of praises for Abu Zar Ghaffari, but no one wants to talk about how he died. Because if you go deep into how he was killed, you would say, well, a top companion of the Prophet abused him in this fashion, kicked him out. Where was the humanity of the Muslim elite at that time? This, again, those who just want to stick to a narrative which camouflages some parts of the problematic history, and it's not to, again, to be critical of Caliph X, for example. The purpose is it explains to you the central themes of Islam. Islam is more interested in justice, in accountability, in a merit based system than a personality. So, and that if you'll forget, you will say, no, anything that happened in the initial years, that is what people, those who say Salafi, they would say, no, no, we'll stick to those original ideas. And without going into what were those original ideas were egalitarianism. And that irrespective of your relationship with the Prophet or having played any important role, if you have committed a crime, you have to be taken to task. Justice is the central pillar, and that's why those who love the Prophet and his family, they have a huge belief in the system of accountability and justice. Because the Muslim authoritarian leaders, and I'll close this point shortly, the original Umayyads or Abbasids, because they had become like monarchies, they had become authoritarian regimes. For them, accountability, justice were not important. So, as soon as you start talking about justice and accountability and egalitarianism, the negative face of authoritarianism starts getting exposed. Today, also in Middle East and South Asia, in many Muslim states, look at the number of countries with authoritarian regimes. So, learning about Ali in an open way will expose their authoritarianism as well. That is, they can't defend it, so they'll say, oh, no words about the companions. Because if that debate opens up about companions, it ultimately comes to the modern day autocrat, authoritarian Muslim personality. And they don't want to do that, whether in Egypt or whichever country you pick. Yes, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, you name a country. And that, so the today's this apparent love for the companions is very self-serving. It is to defend their own vices and their own uh, kind of flaws of the system, but they want to just portray it, oh, we the companions have can't be touched, because they don't want their own character to be exposed.
For anyone who is unaware of the three caliphs that were before Ali, I think it would be good to talk about what the differences were in their character and their leadership, because I think in the book you beautifully explain what his main characteristics were. You said some there like leadership and equity and equality and living like the poor in society, because you, as a leader, you have to live amongst the poor to appreciate their struggle. So can you talk about how, when he became the fourth caliph in 656, I think it was, and how his rule was for those 4 years in comparison to the three caliphs that came before him?
After the Prophet, a new system was built. The idea of caliphate perhaps was not something that was divine in a sense, or that is not something that was choreographed based on the teachings of the Prophet. It was a natural, organic process. Um, it's a very sensitive issue as well for the non-Muslim audience. That's where the real the intricate debate starts. So I will try to be cognizant of that fact and mention briefly the initial part. The most central issue at hand was, as soon as the Prophet passed away and in his final days, um, uh, Ali was around him, like other companions as well. In fact, there's a very interesting story, an important point. Uh, in the very final moments of the Prophet's life, he was in Ali's lap, um, and he was talking about something in Ali's ear. And later on, people asked Ali, "What was Prophet talking about?" And he said something to me which opened up 1,000 doors. Each door opened up another 1,000 doors. We didn't get into the details, but that's where those who believe in the mystical dimensions of Islam talk about that knowledge. And there's this famous hadith, or the saying of the Prophet saying, "Ana Madinatul ilmi wa Aliyun babuha." The Prophet had said, "I am the city of knowledge. Ali is the door." And keep in mind, those were the cities in those days and age when this is like a fort. The city, there's only one door from where you can enter the city, and that's what the spiritual knowledge was bestowed upon Ali. So Ali was totally dedicated to the ideals and idea of Islam like no one else was. As soon as Prophet passed away, Ali being the legal successor, being the closest family, he was son-in-law of the Prophet, he's cousin of the Prophet, he's the chief aide, he was his closest associate in battlefield, in prayer, in his spiritual status. Whenever Prophet used to go to the cave of Hira for his spiritual, in his prayers, only Ali, when he was a child, would accompany him, or Khadija, Prophet's respected wife, would accompany him. With that status, as soon as Prophet passes away, Ali is the one who gets now busy with the burial of the Prophet. Ali was the only one who was authorized to do the final funeral processes, and that was a very important task. That's the moment when a political succession debate starts at a place which is hardly, let's say, in today's terms, a 20, 15, 20 minute to a 30-minute walk from where the Prophet was living and where he was being buried. Ali is now totally dedicated in the burial processes. And the first caliph, who later became first caliph, Abu Bakr, Umar, very important companions, very close. They were in the closest circle of the companions, and a couple of other people. They heard that one of the tribes of the leading tribe of Medina was having these conversations about who will succeed the Prophet. They rushed to that point, and it figured out that the tribe and the leading tribesmen in Medina were about to pick a successor of the Prophet. And they said, they got into a debate and they said, well, we are the ones who had come with the Prophet from Mecca. We have the first right. I'm summarizing it. And the debate it was at a place called Saqifa. The debate got very heated. That's another issue which is mentioned in all the books, but generally Muslims avoid, ignore it. And mostly the predominant group, the majority group, avoids talking about it. The reality is, while Ali is totally dedicated in the Prophet's house, burying him, everyone else among the top companions are debating, and they had good reason to debate because the first caliph of Bakr, Umar, Usman was not there. They were arguing that, well, we are the closest to the Prophet, and we need to be we have to pick a leader among ourselves. After a lot of debates, some hassling, some pushing around, um, Abu Bakr came up as a kind of a consensus candidate in that small gathering, because they said he's the oldest, he was close to the Prophet, he had came to Medina with the Prophet from Mecca, he was in a cave with the Prophet, which is mentioned in the Quran, so it high caliber and high credentials. And when, as soon as this group comes back to where the Prophet is being buried, they realized, and this is another issue which is ignored, the burial process was almost complete. And they said to Ali, they had not involved Ali, and that's a big question. They all knew about Ali's high status. They all knew about his closeness, about his credentials. Why they could not have waited? It was not a modern day age where the rule of law system will fall. It's not the British or the American system, or anywhere in the world where a gap of few hours or one day would have led to the fall of the empire. What was the? I mean, that's the question. What was the hurry? And that created a schism. They could have waited. They would have all said, let's go to the burial process of the Prophet. Tomorrow we will invite everyone, every leader. We'll have a big shura, we have a big consultation, and then we'll finalize. What was it, a backroom deal that someone was deciding? To cut the long story short, they come back to Ali and tell him, well, Abu Bakr has been selected or elected, whatever word you want to use, as the caliph. And Ali stayed as his home. And when everyone is going to the mosque to sign up and to join that, Ali was asked, okay, why now? Please come to the mosque and do a bayah, or give your allegiance to Abu Bakr. And Ali is very straightforward. Ali was not politically ambitious, but Ali was very clear and bold enough. And Ali said to Abu Bakr, just crowned as the first caliph, he said, well, the criterion that you have decided to, that because you became caliph because you are closest to the Prophet, you know very well that I'm the one who's closest. And it is my right, and you have usurped my right. And this is mentioned in Nahjul Balagha, this is mentioned in all major historical books. But the beauty of that argument was, I should say, it's not that Ali took out his sword or Ali started a political campaign. Ali said, that's fine, okay, you have picked. He kept quiet for some time. He knew his right was taken away, but he never allowed that to create a schism. In fact, and many historians write, Ali became kind of opposition leader in a modern sense. And later on, then Abu Bakr he nominates Umar, which is another new model, which had no history. Again, Ali is sidelined. The third occasion comes when Umar, unfortunately, he was attacked by a criminal, a thug, an assassin, and during his final moments, he establishes kind of a consultative committee of six people. But then he frames it in a way which I explained in the book, which he gives a double vote to one person, and he arranges it in a way that things went into the hand of Usman. But that's the final point, the most important point. It came to a point where the third caliph, who was to be elected as third caliph, Usman and Ali, are asked to make a decision about who will be the caliph. One basic question. They were asked, will you accept God and the prophets? First question was, will you follow all the God's principles if you become caliph? Second question, will you follow the prophet's teachings? This was the first question together, in fact. And the second big question was, will you follow the precedents set by the first caliph, Abu Bakr, and Umar? And Usman was quite, Ali was asked this first. He said, absolutely, I will follow what Quran says, or God says. I will follow what the Prophet says. But I am not bound by the statements or decisions of the first and the second caliph. Because Ali knew that in most important cases of jurisprudence, of Islamic principles, it was the first caliphs who would always call upon Ali. No one had challenged Ali's understanding of knowledge, not or actually understanding. Ali was the chief interpreter of what the Prophet had said. So Ali said, I am the one who advised them in many cases. And indirectly, Ali is saying, well, I know far more than the first two caliphs. And that's an acknowledged, accepted fact of his Islamic history. So I don't feel I'm bound by their wisdom. They may be right, they may be wrong in some decisions. I'll make my own decisions. And the committee asked Usman, Usman, will you agree? He said, yes, I will sign up for all what Quran says. I'll sign up for what the Prophet says. And I will exactly follow what the first and second caliph have done. He was trying to build his network around the network of the first two caliphs. There was a new elite which was created, which there was a close circle. And they said, okay, he's the person who is going with the status quo. It was a new Islamic establishment had become. So Ali was sidelined. In politics, that was his moment. People thronged to his door. In fact, later on, Ali said, there were so many people around my house that I felt if my children will be trampled upon and they'll die. Ali said to everyone, please go to the mosque, I'm coming there. Then there was a certain elite who said to Ali, for the Muslims, their names will be important, Zubair and Talha. They said, no, Ali, please, you become caliph. And Ali said, "Why don't you become caliph? I'll support you. Don't worry. I support the others. I'll support you. I'm not interested." They begged Ali. If there was ever a moment after the Prophet where the Muslim community as a whole really saw someone as a popular person, because Muslims now realize they had seen the Ali as being close to the Prophet, and they knew only he is the one who can rescue us. So that explains the journey of Ali. And to give credit where due, second Caliph Umar was asked this question: uh, why you have not picked Ali? Because we have seen three models. First, kind of a selected small group selecting the first caliph. Second caliph nominates Umar, who was his right hand person, who had his good credentials, who did very important things for Islam. And then Usman was picked up by who was an Umayyad, who was picked up by a committee, which was actually a huge tribal politics at play. And now Muslims realize, no, this has come. So if there was ever a real popular, I would say even fully democratic, transparent system, it was Ali who was a product of that transparent, popular, democratic system in a sense. Not in terms of counting votes, but that was closest to democracy at that time. What we read in the Plato and Aristotle's that city state where everyone has a role. I think this was exactly what happened with picked Ali. And my last point, Ali explained who he was on the very first day in his first sermon, which I couldn't find in one place in Islamic history books. I collected those from, I would say, dozens of books, and that's I've narrated that whole his first sermon very categorical. He said, what was happening in terms of this elitism, this is the end. I'm going to take all the corruption money back. I'm using paraphrasing and using modern words, and that's where he said later on as well, he would eat very little. He would not take any benefits, and people asked him, "Why you're?" Because Islam had become an Islam of palace in a sense. He said, "Neither I'm going to." He moved the capital. He said, "I'm not going to live in the governor's house." He had a small house, and the idea of leadership that he gave was, he said, the leader of any community should keep that level of living which is lived by the most ordinary people, because that has to be reflected in the life of the leader, not in a palace, not in a huge mansion, but the leader has to reflect the plight of the very, very ordinary. And that was the message of egalitarianism. And in his sense, the most interesting thing was when he was on his deathbed. Again, assassinated attempt had been made, and the final piece of advice he gives to his close associates, he said, "Please take care of this, who the person who has tried to kill me. Don't kill him till I am dead. And if you have to really punish him, be just. Give him water. The rope around his hands seems to be too hard, so make him comfortable." And the most important thing he said was, he said, after me, take care of all the people from different communities and different religious identities. This is exactly the message what is recorded in history, is not made up later. When the Prophet is giving his final statement to Ali, few minutes before passing away, he said all that there's a word used, dhimmis, which was used at that time for Christians actually, and non-Muslims. Both the Prophet and Ali were very, very open in terms of the interreligious uh, issues and about the identity. They were not saying the Muslims or my close associates or my family. They were saying everyone, irrespective of their religious identity. That was the message of pluralism that Ali stood for.
What is his legacy? I think that you ended the book by writing a chapter on his legacy. So I think it'd be great to address how a figure from 1400 years ago can relate to today, and what was his main legacy from that time to today, and how his message and his leadership and his qualities and characteristics can be applicable to today's world.
Thank you for that question, an extremely relevant one. And this is what I really wanted, because the purpose was not to just revisit or review a part of Islamic history, but I thought it's so relevant to today in today's world, which is so polarizing. I mean, look at the West and the East, wherever you will see the conservative versus the liberal, or the hardliner versus the others, the polarization. Look what has happened in the United States and UK, where you and I are living, or elsewhere, or India, for that matter. Polarization, kind of this religious bigotry, divisiveness, has become a huge challenge. Ali, when he had become the caliph, was interestingly the first challenger to Ali was one of the wives of the Prophet, Aisha, um, an accomplished lady, very important. She was daughter of the first caliph Abu Bakr as well. She and the other two names I had mentioned, Zubair and Talha, they had joined hands. The elite had joined hands to challenge Ali. And Muslim history is convinced, whether Shia or Sunni, that Ali was the one who, as a caliph, who was on the right. Um, then Ali is challenged by Muawiyah, one of his governors, who had amassed a lot of wealth and power, and Ali fought against him as well multiple times. And then there was a third group that Ali had fought, and I'm mentioning it because it's all linked to legacy. The third group was called Khawarij, which are seen as the forerunners of today's Daesh, or Salafism or extremism, and part of this extreme Wahhabism. Ali had fought the extremist Muslims within, after providing them almost equal opportunity to express their views. Ali had never stopped anyone in the mosque sermon, to make him accountable, or anyone to question him. And he would always, when people would try to throw out some people, he would say, no, they have a right to their opinion. Till the time they are going to adopt violent ways, I'm not going to fight them. This is an important legacy of Ali, of trying to keep people together, trying to push out and challenge those who are extremists, whether politically or in religious sense, but also trying to be true to the central principles of the religion. His legacy is now unfortunately divided into three areas. One is those who are called Shiane Ali, those who argued that things went wrong because Ali's right was taken away. If their argument, the Shia argument is, if Ali had become the first caliph, things would not have come to pass. Things would not have deteriorated the way, in terms of internal Muslim cohesion, in terms of the principles of justice, in terms of pluralist ideas, and the counter argument is, no, those were close associates. They also had an important right. They had their support base, whether tribalism or not, and Ali never fought them. So Ali, in principle, had no issues. And the reality might be somewhere in the middle. But to pursue that middle path, there's this one group which is part of the legacy of Ali, which is extremely important, the Sufi tradition, or what we call the Irfan, also in the Shia tradition, the mystical dimension of Islam, let me say. These were the people who thought that there's too much politics around the idea of the Shia and the idea of the Sunni. The Sunni idea was more of I'm borrowing words from a Western scholar of Islam, that this was those who believed in the status quo, in the establishment. They became Sunni. Those who were the challengers, who defied that status quo and emphasized that Ali should have been given his right, even if Ali was not fighting. They become two pillars, and but two divergent paths, going towards the same end, but slightly in a roundabout fashion. And the Sufis and the mystics argued, look, we can avoid this discussion about the political succession, and let's focus more. I'm generalizing it. Let's focus more on the legacy of Ali as the spiritual master, on which no one has a debate, no one has a doubt. And there were 13 systems or silsilas in this mysticism process. 12 of those are directly linked to Ali. Even the 13th one is linked to Jafar Sadiq, the sixth Imam for the Shia, but for Sunnis, equally important. He's the founder is not the right word. He was the one who codified the Jafari school of thought, which is called the Shia school of thought. And the Imams of the Sunni schools of thought, there are four Sunni major schools: Hanbali, Shafi, Hanafi, and Maliki. Three of them were either the students of Jafar Sadiq or very close to him. So in the jurisprudence side, actually, there's a lot of cohesion. And Jafar Sadiq, the 13th system or the 13th line of spirituality or Sufism comes to Jafar Sadiq because he had another very important distinction. He was the great grandson of Ali, but he was from his mother's side great grandson of Abu Bakr. So that was a very interesting thought, which would bring people together, and that's why Sunnis respect him greatly. That he was, in his life and his personality, in his roots, he reflected both Abu Bakr and Ali. But these spiritual masters argue that the path to spirituality is through Ali, and the master, the patron saint of Islam. I received some criticism on using the word patron saint, and I thought there's no other way I can explain it to my Western non-Muslim audience. I should say non-Muslim more so because Islam is as Western as Eastern, and Muslims are part and parcel of the Western tradition as well. So it's not Islam and West; it's Islam in the West. But it is the spiritual tradition which brings the legacy of Ali back into life. And they did it by avoiding the sectarian debates and by getting into the issues which divided Muslims. And those divisions were, I would argue, are fine so long as those debates are done in a scholarly academic fashion, or this debate is done to understand. Unfortunately, those two pillars of Shia and Sunnism got mixed up with geopolitics, got mixed up with tribalism, and led to these divergent paths. Whereas these were two ideas, major ideas, which were extremely important, and there's beauty in both. I mean, in the book, I have, in terms of his legacy, if you allow me, I just want to mention two sentences. I ended with two major scholars, both by chance. I mean, by Sunni. Not that I wanted it to end. I should have ideally have one Shia statement and one Sunni. But irrespective of exactly, and this is by Muqtadar Khan, an American scholar of Sunni background, who says in his very important comments about Ali. He wrote an essay called Everybody Loves Ali." This he borrowed from a famous American drama series, Everyone Loves Raymond, if I remember correctly. And he had said, he asked a very interesting question. He says, if Ali can help Muslims come closer to God, why can't he also be someone who brings Muslims closer to each other? Ali is the Sufism allowed that, and I would say the legacy of Karbala also brings everyone together. Um, so the legacy of Ali is as a bridge builder. Ali was convinced, very clear, his right was usurped when it comes to political power. But because that was not important for Ali, to be a caliph was not something that added to Ali's credentials. In fact, this is one of the Sunni leading imams. I'm forgetting it was Shafi'i or Maliki who had said that it's not that caliphate, the title of caliphate has brought anything to Ali. In fact, that title has become more important because Ali has become caliph. And the second statement that I would mention is by Michael Muhammad Knight, converted Muslim, an amazing writer and a very interesting person. He has a famous book called Why I Am a Salafi. And I'll borrow from his one. He says, if there's anything universal is in Islam, it is the love of Ali. But he then further says about the Shia Sunni dynamic, and this I think is the legacy of Ali, for which I'm giving this background. I'm quoting him, says, the division between Sunni and Shia treatments of the Prophet's family appears as the point of separation between the ocean and the beach. While we might perceive a clear difference between them, we also recognize that the tide constantly goes in and out, moving the point at which one begins and the other ends. Unquote. It's going deeper into Ali's life, I think, allows Muslims to go back to their original ideals and ideals of Islam, which is about rule of law, which is about accountability, which is about equality, which is about being above the prejudice, this idea of takfir, which says This is my view. Everyone else is a non-Muslim. And even if there's a non-Muslim in a Muslim land, um, there's established rules and legacy for the purpose of the Islamic State. There's absolutely no difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim as to a people's rights. These things, because contradict the modern Islamic jurisprudence on the authoritarian states that they have built around them. That's why they had thrown out, pushed out Jews from Middle East, or from many communities, the Christian communities. That was not done during the time of Ali, or we have not heard Prophet said to anyone that they cannot enter Mecca. Today, can every Muslim go to Mecca? What is the basis of this idea that non-Muslims cannot go to Mecca? In the initial years, and this is debatable, I must acknowledge the larger point I'm making, it's about the pluralist idea. Legacy of Ali is pluralism. Legacy of Ali is accountability. Legacy of Ali is selflessness. Legacy of Ali is humanity. And if I have to add one last statement, Ali's most famous statement says it all. Ali said, people are of two kinds. Either you are my brother in faith, or you are my brother in humanity. That's the legacy of it.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. I don't think you could find a better way to end it. So, Dr. Hassan, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your book, The Prophet's Heir: The Life of Ali Ibn Abi Talib. Where's the best place that people can find you if they want to contact you, on website or social media?
Yes, social media. Watan Dost is my Twitter handle. They can see me on LinkedIn, but social media, Watan Dost on Twitter. They can find me. My if there are any questions or discussions, they with a little effort they'll find my email easily. I don't want to mention publicly, but they go to the Harvard website, and there my email details are there. They can contact me through you if there are any questions. Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.